My name is Lara Macon, and I'm a range technician at the Jornada. And what I'm going to be talking to you about this afternoon is the practical application of a lot of the things Dr. Utsumi just talked about. So using precision ranging technology for adaptive grazing management. And this little case study we did the last 6 months on the Jornada. So briefly, I'll just go over, Santiago touched on it, but what is precision ranching? It's the use of sensors and technologies to increase your productivity and efficiency while decreasing labor inputs for livestock production. So some of the examples of this would be GPS collars for livestock, virtual fence collars for livestock, water level sensors, and then also tipping bucket automatic rain gauges. So at the Jornada, some of the technology we have deployed are LoRaWAN, which is the communication pathway these devices use. GPS tracking collars and then the water level sensors we've had deployed at the Jornada since the beginning of 2020, almost 2.5 years now. And then we've had no fence virtual fence collars since last November, so almost a year. And right now we're running both these GPS tracking collars along with the no fence virtual fence collars in a single collar unit, like you see here. So the tracker is on top of her neck and then the virtual fence collar unit is below. These two systems are independent of one another. The reason we have them paired up is for research needs, but you would need to do this in a practical setting. So briefly, for anyone who doesn't know, I'm just going to go over how virtual fence works. So it's an animal containment system via digital pastures. The collars use an auditory cue to warn animals when they approach a virtual boundary. If they ignore that audio cue, they will receive an electric pulse. This happens 3 times, the audio cue with the pulse, the audio cue with the pulse, and then the animal, if she keeps pushing on, is considered escaped out of that virtual pasture. It's one directional, so when she decides to come back into the grazing area, she doesn't get an electric pulse, so they can come back in easily. And then training is necessary. You need to learn the system as the human, as the manager. And it's also really important that your stock learn the system before you turn them out in pasture. So we put all of our animals through a virtual fence training protocol. All these devices have to connect somehow. Different devices have different connectivity patterns. So are you going to be using a virtual fence collar that relies on cellular network or a LoRaWAN based network? Thinking about that and how you're going to get service to those devices is really important. Kind of our final one that we've talked a lot about today, one of our biggest challenges is variable precipitation and our persistent droughts. And how can we use this added technology to help make decisions about when and where we're going to graze? So when we're talking about adaptive management, that's a strategy that can be used to increase your flexibility and help manage in the face of changing conditions. So you want to look at what are your objectives or the issue that you're trying to solve, take into account all your previous management actions and how those worked, and then also incorporate back in some monitoring data. So for us at Jornada for the cattle program, our objectives were kind of twofold. First, we wanted to provide adequate forage to the cattle using precision ranching technologies, and then in turn use those technologies to monitor the grazing pressure around the range and protect the range resource. So monitor the use of our perennial forages. So this last February was decision-making time. We started discussing where we were going to graze the cattle for the next 6 months for the growing season. Previously, one of the most important factors we had to consider is the fencing condition in our pastures. We have a lot of perimeter fencing that needs some repair, whether it's oryx damage or flash flooding going through. We just have a lot of perimeter fencing that needs some TLC and wouldn't contain cattle. But with virtual fencing, that part of the decision making has been, we don't have to look at that as our primary decision for where to graze. So next we want to look at precip records. We talked about all morning, but this is a graph of the last decade of rainfall at the Jornada headquarters. 6 out of the last 10 years have been below average. Last year, we were 50% of average, and this year we're on track to be less than 50% of average. Kind of a bleak picture. So then the other thing we want to look at along with rainfall is our production data. So this map was taken from data from the rangeland analysis platform, looking at herbaceous growth from February 23 to February 2024. If I showed you this map and I told you that we couldn't graze in pasture 9 over here, pasture 9 over here because of ongoing studies, where would you say we should move the cattle? Pasture 19. So that's the decision we came to too. Pasture 19 is a huge pasture, almost 24,000 acres. Up in the northern portion up here, it's characterized by a lot of sandy and deep sand ecological sites. So thinking we got a lot of mesquite, a lot of sand dunes with perennial grasses intermixed in the interspaces, a lot of mesa dropseed and black grama, some Indian rice grass up there. And then down in the southern portion, we have more loamy ecological sites, more drainages and draws. There's a little bit more creosote down there, and our perennial grasses down there, more alkali, sagaton, and tubosa. And then this layout of the pasture, this ecological layout of the pasture makes it really nice to divide into 4 different sub-pastures for doing some sort of grazing study potentially. This pasture had not been grazed by cattle since 2018. However, we have many of these guys up there. So there is a lot of grazing pressure by oryx. Exactly what that grazing pressure is pretty hard to quantify. But there is evidence of grazing pressure up there by them. Like I said, we hadn't used this pasture previously because of the perimeter fencing being in such poor condition. I think Brandon said earlier, if we had grazed this pasture before we had virtual fence, we would be getting calls from the missile range to come get our cows back. This pasture butts up to white sands. So I hadn't used it without virtual fence. So for our study design, I do just want to say off the bat that the study design was mostly driven by cattle management. So not everything is perfectly even or replicable. So just keep that in mind. But we wanted to contain the cattle in sub-pastures using virtual fencing. And we have 2 different herds of cattle. We have 2 different breeds that we run at the Jornada. We wanted to keep both breeds separate. We don't have the same number of animals in each herd. So we only have 29 head of Angus Hereford cows. And right now we have about 60 head of rare Murray and Criollo cattle, which are a biotype breed from a heritage breed from Mexico. And then we're going to have 2 different grazing periods of about a little over 2 months each. So grazing period 1, we would be in the south part of pasture 19. Grazing period 2, we'd be in the north. And then each sub-pasture included an exclosure, virtual fence exclosure in it from day 1. We were hoping to maybe use that virtual fence exclosure to try to quantify oryx utilization, since there would be 0 cattle utilization in those areas. Now at the end of the growing season, we can go back and measure utilization in those and maybe start to get an idea of that impact from wild ungulates. So monitoring the grazing pressure with the precision ranching dashboard. So this is the dashboard that Dr. Itsumi just showed. It works with the GPS tracking collars that were on top of that collar unit in that picture. And we wanted to use this system to answer that second objective of monitoring grazing pressure throughout the range and protecting areas that maybe were potentially getting overgrazed. So we use this dashboard to monitor grazing hotspots every week. All that location data came from those GPS collars. I will note that the virtual fence collars we used have a similar dashboard setup, and they do show a similar kind of heat map like this of grazing pressure. With the precision ranching dashboard that Santiago showed us, the user is able to input specific date ranges and specific individual animals. You have a lot more control over this dashboard than you do the virtual fence dashboard, which is why we chose to use this dashboard instead of the virtual fence one. So each week we would select the top 3 hotspots for each herd, do this every week. And we would do this qualitatively, so just looking at heat maps like this, and selecting the areas that had the largest hotspots and then the most red, which would signify the most animal density. And then we wanted to have some parameters that we had to follow too. So hotspots had to be at least 100 meters away from their watering point. Cattle like to congregate around water, and we wouldn't be able to exclude them from that area anyway. South was their watering source. And then hotspots had to be at least 50 meters away from one another to be considered its own hotspot. If they were closer than 50 meters, we would just consider that whole area one hotspot. So if we're looking at this image here, this would be one hotspot, and there's no scale on this map, but that would be hotspot 2. They are greater than 50 meters away from each other. That would be hotspot 3, and those would be our top 3 hotspots for the week. This one down here, not considered a hotspot because it's too close to their watering area. So then hotspots that were repeatedly visited for 2 weeks, and they didn't have to be 2 weeks consecutive, were monitored for utilization pressure. So we would go out in the field and we would measure, we'd have 3 25-meter transects in a spoke design. And along those transects, we would measure the stubble height of perennial grasses every 2 meters. We would identify whether that individual plant was grazed or ungrazed. We'd take plot photos and then give an overall ocular estimate of utilization for the plot. Our threshold for utilization was 30%, and that's based on Jerry Holochek's grazing guidelines for the Toronto Desert. Also taking into account that there's ungulate grazing pressure out there too, so the range is probably being utilized beyond 30%, but what we can quantify from the cattle, we don't want to surpass 30%. Once we went out and measured and we found that utilization had surpassed 30% at a particular hotspot, a virtual fence exclosure was built to exclude cattle from continuing to graze there if they came back to revisit that site. And we wanted to make sure, so the tricky thing about building virtual fence exclosures is there's no visual cue for the animals once you put that exclosure up. They're just getting the audio cues from their collars. So you have to think about certain things when you lay out those exclosures. You want to make sure that they don't obscure any of the paths to water or their access to other resources like shade. So it's kind of a balancing act. So I'll just show you this example from grazing period 2 with our Angus herd. This was a hotspot that came up right here. And there's 2 nice oak shade trees right there along the road that the cows would hang out at every afternoon for shade. But it came up as a hotspot in week 1. This is week 2, hotspot again. So that triggers us to go out and look at utilization there. Now, we're not going to go, when we go out to measure utilization and we go to the spot, it's sandy, it's along the road, it's just a big bare ground, sand, trees. We're not going to go measure perennial grass utilization right there. But the cattle are loafing here, they're resting here, and then they go out and kind of graze in this area northwest of that spot. So that's where we would go out and monitor utilization. Even though this showed up as the hotspot, person who's going out to monitor kind of had to go out and look at the site and say, okay, the hotspot is here, but where's the grazing pressure? So then in week 3, you can see again, this came up as a hotspot, and we have the cows grazing out here a little bit more, maybe a little bit more pressure out there. And week 3, we did find that they had surpassed that 30% utilization threshold in this area here by the hotspot. And then we built a virtual fence exclosure around that area. We wanted to make sure that the animals still had access to this loafing area, to that shade, and to this road, because cattle tend to have a path that they continue to use to get to water, to get to other resources. And they would use this road to go up to water up in this northeast corner. So we didn't want to block off that access to them. So we made this exclosure, we left a 30-meter buffer between the road and the edge of the exclosure. And then this image is from the week that we built that virtual fence exposure. So the shade area is still showed up as a hotspot, but we don't have any of that other kind of grazing pressure in this exposure area. And then the other thing when building virtual fence exposures is we wanted to avoid any sharp points or narrow alleyways, which is why we tacked on this exposure to this already existing day one exposure. Rather than making just a small virtual fence exposure here and leaving like this kind of awkward alley between, the cows could get caught in and not know where to go, we just decided to exclude the whole thing. And you can see in this image here, these are location, it's another heat map, but the animals navigated around this exposure with no problem. I mean, it kept them out of this area that we wanted to protect. You're still able to use the road and get around and go to water. So that's kind of the ideal situation right there. So we haven't done a deep dive yet into all the data we collected from the summer, but we do have some preliminary results. So in grazing period 1, which was April 24th to July 25th, about 2 months, our Angus herd had 11 repeatedly visited hotspots here, while the Criollo had 7. In grazing period 2, which was July 26th through October 1, both herds only had 3 repeatedly visited hotspots each. And this grazing pattern, where the Angus had more hotspots, even though there was fewer animals in that herd, and the Criollo had less hotspots during the pre-green up stage, so that would be grazing period 1. And then they had kind of the equal number of grazing hotspots in grazing period 2, which is during green up, has been observed in previous research studies, both on the Jornada and elsewhere in Mexico and Argentina. There's a reference for that paper if anyone was curious. So in grazing period 1, out of those 11 hotspots that were repeatedly visited, we excluded them from grazing 1 down here. And then there was also a hotspot where the Criollo were grazing in period 1 that reached over 30% utilization. This one here, but because of its proximity to water, the cattle were watering down here. This point was right along the fence line, and actually it's not shown here, but there was a trap in here. So the cattle had to walk down along that fence line to get to water. We can't build a virtual fence exposure that obscures them from that traveling path to water. They would just butt up against that exposure a ton. It wouldn't do much good. So in grazing period 2, we excluded both herds from 1 hotspot. Throughout this, we were up there for 5 months, I think. It seemed like both herds did a pretty good job self-regulating their grazing. So they'd move off those hotspots before or nearing that 30% utilization threshold. And that makes sense. We had very low stocking density, so it makes sense that the animals would move on to fresh forage and not kind of linger on the spots that they'd already grazed. The virtual fence exposures were successful at preventing further grazing in these hotspots, and the cows reacted really well to having this novel exposure put in during the middle of the grazing period. So this is a nice visual. This is an exposure we put up for the Criollo in the middle of their grazing period. And you can see this is data from 2 individuals, and 1 cow just came up and she bumped that boundary, getting those audio cues, but respecting them, staying out of that area we wanted to exclude. These 2 electric pulses were from her friend over here. Didn't do, but that's a good ratio of audio cues to electrical cues to see. That's telling us that it's successful. If all we saw around here were a bunch of lightning bolts and cows were getting pulses, we weren't effectively keeping animals out of there. So in the future, there's some things we want to do going forward. So Santiago touched on this a little bit, but looking at cattle grazing patterns in relation to changes in biomass and using remotely sensed data to do that. So looking at the rangeland analysis platform to see if we can pick up changes. Maybe this was a hotspot from the previous week. Can we detect those tiny changes using The other thing we want to do is, so that example I gave earlier with the shade trees and that hot spot, that was a hot spot that came up because the animals were resting in that area. But can we differentiate behavior based on GPS locations, based on that data, and just look at actual grazing hotspots? So this is similar to what Santiago showed, but the white is more resting points and the green is more walking or grazing points. So these kind of clusters of white would be resting areas. In the future, can we filter those out so that we're truly only looking at grazing hotspots? And then just, I'll go over briefly some of the pros and cons of using precision ranching technology. There's always pros and cons. Probably the biggest pro is that it allowed us to graze in a pasture that we wouldn't have been able to use without virtual fence. So when we were talking earlier about drought strategies or strategies for dealing with drought, this is what saved us this year, is being able to graze a pasture that had previously not been grazed for a handful of years using virtual fence. We're also able to monitor the pasture use in near real time, which is pretty novel. Previous studies that have looked at grazing use from GPS collars usually had to wait till the end of the growing or the grazing season, take those collars off the animals, then get your data, and then go look at utilization. But we could do this in real time. We could exclude areas that we had management concerns about or that had reached a utilization threshold in the middle of that grazing period. We didn't have to wait till next year to make those changes. And it also saved us a ton of time gathering cattle because all the collars had that GPS component. So we saved a lot of time gathering animals. Some of the cons, if you're using technology likes to break. So we had a few collars break. We also had this heifer come in, just missing her virtual fence component of her collar. The nice part about that is they all have GPS in them, so you can go out and find them. But then you're spending time to go out and find a collar might take, this day I think it took me 2 hours total to go from headquarters, to go out in the pasture, to find the unit, to bring it back in, to put it back on the animal. So you have to think about that time that you have to allot now to recover the technology. You also need to think about, okay, the collar fell off the cow. How do I get it back on her out in the middle of the range? You need infrastructure in place to be able to work on the collars. A lot of the places we were grazing this summer didn't, so we made do with setting up temporary chutes and stuff to put collars back on animals. Finally, I just want to thank everyone who was involved this summer. This project, it was a big undertaking. It was a lot of driving and trailering cattle very far. So thank you to everyone who helped out.